She only wants you for your money, my sister Chloe announced to my fiancé, her voice carrying across the private dining room. My mother smirked, swirling her champagne. Ask her about the older man she has been sneaking into hotels with, she added. I sat perfectly still and did not defend myself. Then Julian calmly reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a single high-resolution photograph, looked directly at my sister, and asked if this was the man she meant. Before I tell you what happened, when the truth shattered their perfect facade, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who desperately wanted to see you fail. My name is Maya. I am 33 years old, and until tonight my family thought I was nothing more than a boring accountant who got incredibly lucky finding a successful man. The setting for my public execution was supposed to be my own rehearsal dinner, exactly 2 weeks before I was set to marry Julian. We were at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Chicago. The dinner had barely begun when Chloe made her move. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a stack of photographs, and tossed them across the white tablecloth. They slid in front of Julian's plate. I think you deserve to know who you are marrying, Chloe declared, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. A friend of mine spotted Maya at the Grand Hotel last Tuesday. She was going up to a suite with a much older man. Look at the pictures, Julian. She is nothing but a gold digger paying her bills the old-fashioned way. The photos were blurry, taken from a distance. They showed me standing next to a distinguished-looking older gentleman in a dark suit. We were walking toward the elevators. I did not panic. I simply picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. My mother Brenda jumped on the opportunity to tear me down. She leaned forward, resting her diamond-clad hands on the table. I warned you, Julian, Brenda said, shaking her head with an exaggerated sigh. This girl has always been the ghetto embarrassment of our respectable family. We tried to raise her. We paid for her to take the medical school entrance exams, but she failed on purpose just to go work some boring accounting job. She has always been jealous of Chloe. Chloe married into society. Chloe has a real life. Maya just pretends. Chloe sat up straighter, adjusting the sleeve of her silk dress. She had always been the golden child, the one my parents paraded around our tight-knit African-American community. Her greatest achievement in my parents' eyes was marrying Trent. Trent sat next to Chloe, swirling his expensive scotch. He was a 32-year-old white man who worked in wealth management, and my parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on. They believed his presence elevated our family status completely, ignoring his constant condescension. Trent chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. It is a classic tale, Julian, Trent said, using that smooth, patronizing tone he saved specially for me. Some people just cannot handle the pressure of earning their own keep. In the circles I run in, we call women like Maya opportunists. You are a successful guy. You need a wife with class and pedigree, not someone engaging in this kind of low-rent street behavior. You should really rethink this wedding before she drains your bank accounts. My father Marcus nodded vigorously in agreement from the head of the table. Trent knows what he is talking about, Julian. Marcus chimed in. You need to listen to him. He manages millions. Maya has always been a disappointment. We love her, but she lacks the basic moral foundation this family was built on. The sheer audacity of their performance was almost impressive. They were actively trying to destroy my relationship right in front of me, using blurry photos and their own deeply ingrained prejudices against my chosen career. They thought Julian, whom they believed was just a mid-level tech support worker, would be humiliated and walk away. Julian looked at the blurry photos on the table. He did not look angry. He did not look betrayed. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He picked up the top photograph and examined it. It is a bit out of focus, Julian noted casually. Let me help you out with a better angle. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a crisp, high-resolution photograph. He placed it squarely on top of Chloe's blurry evidence. The new photo showed the exact same older man, but this time his face was perfectly clear, and he was wearing a badge on a lanyard around his neck. Julian looked directly at my sister, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative pitch that commanded instant silence in the room. You mean this man, Julian asked? You mean Special Agent Thomas Henderson from the Internal Revenue Service Financial Crimes Division? The silence that fell over the private dining room was absolute. Chloe's smug smile vanished instantly. My mother's mouth opened and closed without making a sound. My father stared at the photograph as if it might bite him. But Trent had the most dramatic reaction of all. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale white. The heavy crystal Scotch glass slipped from his suddenly numb fingers. It hit the edge of the table and shattered onto the hardwood floor, sending liquor and shards of glass everywhere. Why, my father stammered, his eyes darting frantically. Why would you be meeting with a federal agent? I looked right at Trent, watching the beads of sweat begin to form. Because someone at this table is laundering a massive amount of money. Trent forced a sharp laugh. He brushed his pants, his face flushing before settling back into his familiar mask. He turned his attention entirely to my father. Marcus, you have to excuse her, Trent said. She does not understand how high-level wealth management works. When you deal with the capital, I manage you cross paths with federal agents. It is standard compliance protocol. Maya sees conspiracies where there are only business audits. She is projecting her own insecurities onto Chloe and me. My mother eagerly seized the lifeline Trent threw her. Brenda leaned across her plate, her eyes narrowing at me with genuine disgust. Trent is right, she snapped loudly, pointing her finger at me. You have been looking for ways to tear this man down since Chloe brought him home. You sit in your cramped apartment crunching numbers for pennies while your sister travels the world. You thought you could come into this dinner, flash a picture of an agent, and ruin the happiness of your sister. You need help. I sat perfectly still, letting their insults wash over me. Julian shifted beside me, his shoulder brushing mine in a silent gesture of unwavering support. He kept his expression neutral. He knew the plan. He knew I needed them to dig their own graves before I buried them. My father stood up. He pointed a trembling finger at me, preparing to defend the man he viewed as his ultimate trophy. How dare you accuse Trent of anything illegal? Marcus bellowed. Trent is the best thing that ever happened to the Adams family. He wrote a $50,000 check to the First Baptist Church Building Fund. He paid for the new community center roof in cash and put my name on the dedication plaque. He elevated us. The country club board is reviewing my membership application because Trent sponsored me. And what do you bring to this family, Maya? Nothing but jealousy and drama. You should be thanking Trent for associating with us instead of making up these lies. Chloe nodded smugly, wrapping her arm tightly around Trent. My husband is a top-tier asset manager. You are just a bitter bookkeeper who cannot handle that I won at life. I let the silence stretch for 5 seconds. I looked at my father, whose face was red from defending a man who viewed him as just an easy mark. I looked at my mother, who was glowing with pride at the supposed generosity of her white son-in-law. Then I looked at Trent. The color had not returned to his face. The confident posture he was forcing was starting to crack around the edges. A bead of sweat rolled down his left temple. I reached into my purse, moving with deliberate slowness. I pulled out a heavy leather wallet, flipped it open, and tossed it onto the center of the table right next to the blurry photographs Chloe had thrown down. A heavy silver shield gleamed under the chandelier light, nestled next to a federal identification card. I am not a bookkeeper, Chloe, I said, my voice dropping to a calm register. I am a senior forensic fraud investigator for the federal government. I track hidden offshore assets for the Department of the Treasury. My mother stared at the badge. My father blinked rapidly, struggling to comprehend the heavy silver shield sitting on the white linen tablecloth. For the past 8 months, I continued leaning forward and locking eyes with Trent. I have been leading a covert task force investigating a massive Ponzi scheme operating right here in Chicago. A scheme that targets minority retirees, draining their life savings through fraudulent investment portfolios. Trent swallowed hard, the apple in his throat bobbing. He tried speaking, but no words came out. Marcus, I said, turning my gaze to my father. You mentioned that Trent donated $50,000 to the church last week to elevate the family name. Did you ever wonder where that money came from? My father frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. It came from his firm. He is a wealthy man. I shook my head slowly, feeling a sharp pang of pity for the older man, who had so easily traded his common sense for a small taste of proximity to wealth and status. It absolutely did not come from his investment firm dad. Trent does not actually have a firm. He just has a fake shell company registered in Delaware with zero legitimate corporate assets. That check he wrote to the church came from a newly opened account at a Cayman Islands bank yesterday. "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, though his voice had lost its booming authority. I pulled a bank statement from my purse and slid it across the table to him. 2 weeks ago, Trent offered to manage your retirement portfolio. He told you he could double your returns if you signed a standard transfer authorization. You thought you were giving him access to manage your funds. You actually signed a complete power of attorney over your financial assets. Marcus picked up the paper, his hands beginning to shake as his eyes scanned the highlighted numbers. That $50,000 donation he used to buy your church plaque and secure your club application. I paused, letting the devastating reality hang in the air. That was your own money, Dad. He drained your pension account 4 days ago to pay for his charity stunt. Your wealthy son-in-law is completely broke and you are currently his absolute primary victim right now. Chloe shattered the heavy silence with a piercing scream. The sound bounced off the mahogany walls of the private dining room sharp enough to make the waitstaff outside pause in their tracks. She lunged across the table, her perfectly manicured hands extended like claws aiming directly for my face. Her silk dress caught on a stray butter knife, tearing loudly, but she did not care. Julian stepped smoothly in front of me, catching her wrists in a firm, unbreakable grip. He pushed her gently but resolutely back into her seat. She thrashed against his hold, her perfectly styled hair falling into her eyes, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. "You are a liar!" she shrieked, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. "You have always been a jealous, spiteful little liar. Trent is a genius. He built his wealth from the ground up and you just cannot stand the fact that he chose me. You cannot stand that my life is perfect while yours is a pathetic joke." My father was still staring at the bank statement, his hands trembling so violently that the paper rattled. He looked up at Trent, waiting for a denial, waiting for the golden son-in-law to laugh and explain how this was all a massive misunderstanding. Trent refused to meet his gaze. He stared firmly at the shattered crystal on the floor, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched near his ear. Chloe slammed her hands on the table, desperate to regain control of the narrative. "Look at this ring, Maya," she yelled, shoving her left hand inches from my face. The massive 3-carat diamond caught the chandelier light, throwing fractured rainbows across the ruined table setting. "Do you think a broke man buys a rock like this? Do you think a broke man buys a $2 million 6-bedroom mansion in the Hamptons with a heated infinity pool and private beach access? We have a summer home that costs more than you will earn in your entire miserable life. We host charity galas, we have a staff, we fly first class to Paris while you clip coupons, you drive a boring sedan while I have a personal driver for my sports cars. We are building a legacy, Maya. You are just a bitter government drone trying to ruin the best thing that ever happened to this family because you know you will never ever measure up to me. You are nothing compared to us." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply let her finish her frantic, desperate monologue. I watched her panting, her chest rising and falling, her eyes wide with a manic need for our parents to believe her over the cold, hard evidence sitting right in front of them. My mother was already nodding along with Chloe, eager to accept any reality where her favorite daughter was not married to a criminal. "Trent is highly leveraged," Brenda insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "Wealthy people move money around all the time. It is called liquidity. Maya does not understand high finance. She just audits tax returns for a living. She is blowing a standard business transaction completely out of proportion to ruin your evening, Chloe. Do not let her win. She is just trying to embarrass us in front of the waitstaff and destroy your beautiful marriage before it even begins." Trent is a respected man in his industry, Maya. He manages portfolios for city council members and board executives. Do you really think they would trust him if he was running some kind of illegal scam? Your petty little job has made you paranoid and vindictive. You need to apologize to your brother-in-law right now. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen a few times, accessing the secure portal for my active investigations. The bright glare of the screen illuminated the dark wood table as I pulled up the live banking document. It was a certified court order, complete with a federal judge digital signature and a timestamp that updated by the second. I slid the phone across the table, stopping it precisely between Chloe and Trent. "I am not blowing anything out of proportion, Mother," I said, my tone remaining entirely conversational. "I am just reading the data. And the data shows that Trent used his own house, that beautiful $2 million Hamptons mansion, as collateral for a high-interest loan from a shadow lender 6 months ago. A loan he defaulted on after losing everything on incredibly reckless offshore options trading." Chloe scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. She stubbornly refused to look at the bright screen. "You can forge anything on a phone, Maya." "I am not falling for your pathetic tricks. We just paid the landscaping staff yesterday. We are hosting a cocktail party there next weekend for the country club board of directors. The house is entirely ours." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I looked at the massive diamond ring sparkling on her shaking finger. The same ring Trent had purchased using funds directly funneled from a vulnerable widow retirement account 3 years ago. "Are you absolutely sure you own that mansion?" I asked, letting the words hang in the heavy air of the dining room. "Because federal forfeiture laws move incredibly fast when gross criminal negligence is involved." Chloe sneered, crossing her arms over her chest. "Of course we own it. We have the deed in our safe." I tapped the screen of my phone one last time, pulling up the final execution order. "You might want to carefully check the current timestamp on this official legal document," I said, tapping the bright glowing digital seal on the screen. "Because the bank final foreclosure order was executed exactly 5 minutes ago. You are both officially homeless as of right now, my dear sister." Chloe stared at the glowing screen of my phone, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The reality of her precious Hamptons mansion slipping through her manicured fingers paralyzed her completely. She looked at Trent, her eyes wide with a desperate plea for him to call me a liar. Trent simply looked away, his silence confirming every word I had spoken. My father Marcus slumped back into his leather chair, clutching his chest as if the air had been violently knocked out of his lungs. He was a man who worshipped wealth, and realizing his entire life savings had evaporated into thin air broke him right there at the dinner table. I expected my mother to rush to his side. I expected Brenda to turn her legendary wrath onto the man who had just destroyed her husband's retirement. I waited for her to scream at Trent to demand answers to protect her family from this parasite. She did absolutely none of that. Instead, Brenda slowly picked up her linen napkin, dabbed the corners of her mouth with terrifying calm, and turned her furious gaze directly onto me. "You just could not leave well enough alone," my mother hissed, her voice vibrating with a cold, toxic anger that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The sheer venom in her tone shocked me more than any of Trent's financial crimes. I stared at her, trying to process what was happening. She was not looking at Trent with disgust. She was looking at me with pure hatred. "You knew," I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "You actually knew he was broke." Brenda slammed her palm flat against the mahogany table. "Of course I knew," she snapped, not a single ounce of shame in her eyes. "I found out about his margin calls 3 months ago when the bank sent a notice to our house by mistake." "You let him steal Dad's retirement fund?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "You sat back and watched him drain your own husband's pension." Brenda rolled her eyes, adjusting her diamond necklace. "Your father was practically begging to give him that money. Marcus wanted to feel like a big-shot investor. But that is entirely beside the point. Trent serves a crucial purpose in this family, Maya. A purpose you could never understand with your small-minded obsession with rules and regulations. Trent gave us access. Before Chloe brought him home, those women at the Oak Ridge Country Club looked at me like I was the help. They ignored my applications, they lost my references, They made sure a black family from the South Side, no matter how much money we made, would never sit at their tables. But Trent is a legacy member. He is white, he wears the right suits, he plays golf with the right politicians, and he opened doors we could have never touched on our own. He got me a seat on the charity board. He got your father a sponsorship. I am finally exactly where I belong in society, and I was not about to let a little financial hiccup ruin my standing. I felt physically sick. My mother was willing to sacrifice her husband's life savings and her daughter's financial security just to drink mimosas with women who fundamentally despised her. You are defending a criminal just to keep your country club membership, I stated, wanting to ensure I heard her correctly. Brenda stood up, towering over me with a look of absolute disgust. I am defending the only strategy that actually works in the real world, she yelled, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the private dining room. We tried with you, Maya. We gave you every advantage to climb the social ladder. We introduced you to doctors, to lawyers, to men of actual pedigree who could have elevated our family name. And what did you do? You rejected all of them. You insisted on this ridiculous notion of independence. You went to a public university, you took a government job, and you humiliated me by bringing home a low-level tech worker. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at Julian, who sat perfectly calm beside me. You refused to play the game, Maya. Your stubborn, selfish independence completely ruined our family's social climbing strategy. Chloe did exactly what she was supposed to do. She secured our position. Trent was an investment in our social equity, and you just came in here and set fire to our entire reputation because you could not stand being the least successful woman at this table. I am the only successful woman at this table, I replied coldly, my voice cutting through her hysterical rant. Everything you and Chloe have is an illusion built on stolen money and desperate lies. My mother let out a sharp, bitter laugh. It does not matter what is real and what is an illusion, she sneered. What matters is what people see. And right now, people see a wealthy family. I will not let you take that away from me. I will not go back to being a nobody. Brenda reached down to her designer tote bag resting on the floor. She pulled out a thick, legal-looking document bound in a blue folder and threw it onto the table. It slid across the smooth wood and stopped inches from my hands. What is this? I asked, refusing to touch the folder. That is a transfer of assets agreement, Brenda commanded, her tone dropping into a deadly, serious ultimatum. Your grandmother left you a $1.5 million trust fund when she passed away because you were her favorite little project. I want you to sign that money over right now. We will use your inheritance to pay Trent's lenders and save this family's face. If you do not sign that document this second, you are dead to me. The blue folder sat there like a loaded weapon. I stared at the thick parchment paper, the neat legal typography, spelling out the absolute surrender of my future to fix my sister's catastrophic present. My mother stood over me, breathing heavily, waiting for my compliance like it was her divine right. My father, finding a sudden burst of borrowed courage from his wife's ruthless pragmatism, crossed his arms and puffed out his chest, completely aligning himself with her demands. Sign the paper, Maya, my father demanded, his voice regaining its familiar booming authority. Your mother is entirely right. We are a family, and family protects its own. You have more money than you could ever possibly need sitting in that trust fund. Trent made a miscalculation, but he is still a man of status. If he goes down, the resulting scandal will drag our name through the mud. You owe us this. You owe this family for everything we provided you. I did not reach for the pen Brenda shoved toward me. I did not even look at the signature line. Instead, the man sitting quietly to my right finally made his move. Julian pushed his chair back with a slow, deliberate scrape against the hardwood floor. He stood up to his full height, gracefully buttoning the center button of his custom-tailored suit jacket. Up until this exact second, Julian had played his assigned role perfectly. He had absorbed every sneer, every condescending remark, and every backhanded compliment my family had thrown his way for the past 2 years. They thought he was a low-level help desk technician who fixed computers in a dark basement. They treated him like the help, assuming his quiet demeanor was a sign of weakness and lack of ambition. "Sit down, Julian," my father barked, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. "This does not concern you. This is family business. You have absolutely no say in how we handle our financial obligations. You are out of your depth here." Julian did not sit down. He did not shrink back. He reached out and placed his hand gently over mine, anchoring me in the storm. Then he looked directly at my father, his gaze stripping away the older man's false bravado layer by layer. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. "Actually, Marcus, this concerns me entirely," Julian said, his voice ringing with a polished, commanding cadence that nobody in my family had ever heard him use. He did not sound like a timid IT guy. He sounded like a man accustomed to tearing hostile witnesses apart in a deposition room. "Furthermore, I highly advise you to instruct your wife to take that document off the table before this situation becomes legally unsalvageable for both of you." Trent let out a sharp, derisive snort from across the table, trying desperately to reclaim some semblance of alpha male dominance. "Look at the computer nerd trying to play lawyer." Trent mocked, though his hands were still shaking violently from my earlier revelation. "Stay in your lane, buddy. You fix routers for a living. You have absolutely no idea how generational wealth or trust funds actually work. Tell your girlfriend to sign the document so we can all move on from this ridiculous tantrum and save what is left of this evening." Julian turned his attention to Trent. He looked at my sister's husband with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining an interesting insect under a microscope. "It is fascinating how confidently you speak about things you do not comprehend, Trent," Julian replied smoothly, his tone dangerously even. "Maya and I always found it highly amusing. When she introduced us, she told you I worked in IT because she wanted to see how this family treated someone they believed possessed no money and no social standing. You all failed that test spectacularly, by the way. But you are correct about one thing. I do not fix routers." Julian reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek, heavy platinum business card and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a soft, authoritative thud right on top of Brenda's extortion document. My father leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read the embossed silver lettering. His jaw went completely slack. My mother stared at the card, her manicured fingers hovering frozen in midair. The heavy silence in the room returned thicker and more suffocating than before. "I am a senior partner at Sterling Vance and Hayes," Julian stated, his voice echoing cleanly off the walls. "I specialize in high net worth estate management and corporate litigation. But more importantly for tonight's discussion, I am the lead executor and managing attorney for your late mother's estate, Marcus. I wrote the exact trust fund document you are currently trying to force Maya to sign away." Chloe gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in sheer terror. Trent sank lower in his chair, the last remaining drops of blood draining from his face as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. My mother looked as though she had been physically struck by an invisible force. "You wrote the trust," Marcus stammered, his eyes darting frantically between Julian and the gleaming platinum card. "But her attorney was an older man. We met him after the funeral. He read the terms to us." "You met my senior partner," Julian corrected effortlessly, clasping his hands behind his back. "He handled the public reading because I prefer to remain behind the scenes. I handled the architecture of the trust itself. Your mother was a highly intelligent woman, Marcus. She built her fortune with shrewd investments and relentless hard work. She also saw exactly who you and Brenda were becoming. She watched you obsess over country clubs and social climbing. She watched you indulge Chloe's worst impulses while completely neglecting Maya. That is exactly why she bypassed you entirely and left the bulk of her liquid assets to Maya. She wanted to ensure her money went to the only grandchild who shared her work ethic and moral compass." My mother slammed her hands on the table, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. She refused to accept defeat. "This is a setup," Brenda shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at Julian. "You planned this together. You targeted my daughter to get access to our family money. You are just as much of a con artist as you claim Trent is. I will hire my own lawyers. I will have that trust broken. I will contest my mother-in-law's mental capacity. Maya is signing this transfer tonight, and neither of you can stop me. Julian did not raise his voice. He simply offered a smile so cold it could have frozen the champagne in their glasses. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the edge of the mahogany table, dominating the space completely. You clearly do not understand the gravity of what you just did, Brenda Julian said, softly, enunciating every single syllable. You cannot force her to sign that document. You cannot contest the trust. And you certainly cannot hire a lawyer to fix this mess. In fact, by sliding that extortion demand across this table and threatening to disown Maya if she did not surrender her inheritance to cover Trent's criminal debts, you just made a catastrophic legal error. Julian tapped his index finger sharply against the platinum business card resting on the blue folder. Your mother-in-law knew you would eventually try to steal Maya's money to fund your superficial lifestyle. Julian explained, his words dropping like heavy stones in the silent room. She anticipated your greed perfectly. She instructed me to embed a highly specific, irrevocable condition into the very foundation of the estate. By attempting to extort Maya tonight, you just triggered Grandma's toxic clause. Julian's voice was a calm blade slicing through the tension. He picked up the document Brenda threw and held it to the light. The toxic clause is an elegant piece of legal architecture, Julian explained, pacing behind my chair. Eleanor knew you would try to siphon Maya's inheritance to fund your lifestyle or bail Chloe out, so she established a strict trigger. If any beneficiary or their representatives attempted to coerce, defraud, or extort another beneficiary, their portion would be immediately forfeited. My mother blinked, her face twisting into a mask of confusion. What are you talking about? Brenda demanded, her voice cracking. We are not extorting anyone. We are simply asking Maya to do her duty as a member of this family. Forcing a signature under the threat of disownment to pay a fraudulent shadow loan is the textbook definition of coercion, Brenda Julian corrected. He dropped the folder onto the table like it was contaminated. By sliding this transfer agreement across the table and issuing that ultimatum, you met the legal threshold for extortion. The penalty is enforced. Chloe stopped breathing. She gripped the table, her knuckles turning white. What penalty? Chloe whispered, her eyes darting frantically between Julian and the folder. What does that mean for my money? It means you no longer have any money, Chloe Julian stated with clinical precision. Your 50% share of the estate was contingent upon you and your parents respecting Maya's financial autonomy. Since your mother just violated that core stipulation on your behalf, your entire allocation is revoked. The trust immediately transfers your remaining balance directly to Maya. She is now the sole beneficiary of the $3 million estate. The harsh reality crashed into Chloe like a runaway freight train. She let out a guttural, agonizing shriek that tore through the quiet room. No, Chloe screamed violently, sweeping her arms across the table. Plates shattered against the floor. Crystal wine glasses exploded into thousands of glittering shards. She grabbed her own hair, pulling at the extensions as her constructed reality disintegrated. You cannot do this to me. That money is my safety net. Trent is broke. The bank is taking my house. I need that trust fund. You cannot let her steal my money. She collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, tears leaving dark streaks of mascara down her cheeks. The golden child was broken, stripped of her arrogance, and reduced to a panicked, destitute mess. Marcus finally snapped completely out of his paralyzed state. He pushed himself up, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Julian's chest, trying to summon the authority he used to terrify his employees. Listen to me, you arrogant little punk, Marcus bellowed loudly. I do not care what kind of platinum card you carry. You do not come into my dinner and steal my daughter's money. I will hire litigators to bury you. I will tie this up in probate court for 2 decades. You will be disbarred before you give Maya a single dime. Julian did not even blink once. He stood perfectly still, exuding the terrifying calm of absolute, untouchable power. You are welcome to try, Marcus Julian replied. Any attempt to contest an irrevocable trust under the Uniform Trust Code, specifically invoking a documented in terrorem clause, will result in immediate dismissal with prejudice. Furthermore, I have an audio recording of this conversation legally obtained under this state's one-party consent law, capturing your wife explicitly extorting my client. If you file a motion, I will submit this recording to the district attorney. You will not be fighting me in probate court. You will be fighting felony extortion charges in criminal court. Do you want to risk a prison sentence to protect a son-in-law who stole your pension? Marcus opened his mouth to shout, but no sound came out. The blustering patriarch was completely neutralized, suffocated by Julian's legal reality. He sank back into his chair, looking like a deflated balloon. Brenda covered her face with her hands, finally understanding the magnitude of her mistake. They had tried to sacrifice me to save themselves, and in doing so, they had burned their own kingdom to the ground. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by Chloe's sobbing. We had won. The facade was shattered, the money was secured, and the toxic grip my parents held over my life was severed. I reached for Julian's hand, ready to leave this nightmare behind us. But the nightmare was not over. A low chuckle echoed from the far end of the table. Trent stood up slowly. The sweating coward from 5 minutes ago was gone. His polite posture melted away, replaced by something rigid, cornered, and dangerous. He unbuttoned his jacket, his eyes locked onto me with a dead hollow stare that made my blood run cold. You both think you are so smart, Trent said, his voice dropping an octave into a rough, gravelly register. You think you can just wave your little court orders and your trust fund documents and walk away the winners? You think you broke me. He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a thick stack of folded papers. He slammed the heavy document onto the center of the ruined table. The top page was covered in black redaction bars, obscuring everything except a set of menacing, unfamiliar signatures at the bottom. You completely misunderstood the game we are playing? Maya, Trent sneered, leaning over the table like a predator. I did not just lose money on bad stock options. I owed people who do not use banks. I use this very house, the property we are standing inside, as collateral for a massive loan from a shadow syndicate. And because your federal raid froze my accounts this morning, I missed my final payment. They are not sending a foreclosure notice, Maya. They are coming to collect their collateral, and they are coming tonight. The heavy oak doors of the dining room suddenly felt like the gates of a cage. The ambient noise of the restaurant outside seemed to vanish entirely, sucked away by the suffocating vacuum of Trent and his confession. For a moment, nobody moved. The reality of a shadow syndicate coming to collect on a $2 million debt was too massive, too violent for my parents to process. They were accustomed to white-collar problems, to country club gossip, and passive-aggressive board meetings. They were absolutely not equipped to handle the criminal underworld knocking on their front door. Trent paced the length of the ruined table. He dragged a hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive cut, leaving him looking wild and unhinged. He ripped his silk tie off and threw it onto the floor. The polite, sophisticated finance bro mask completely evaporated, revealing the ugly, desperate animal underneath. You stupid, arrogant people! Trent spat, his voice dripping with pure venom. He stopped pacing and glared at my father. Did you honestly believe I married into this family because I loved your insufferable, vapid daughter? Did you think I actually wanted to sit through your excruciating Sunday dinners and listen to you brag about your mediocre regional supply company? Marcus opened his mouth, his face a portrait of utter shock, but Trent cut him off with a vicious bark of laughter. Do not act so surprised, Marcus, Trent yelled, his face turning a blotchy red. You and Brenda used me. You paraded me around your little social circles like a trophy. You loved the fact that a white man with the right accent and the right connections was willing to sit at your table. You loved how my presence instantly legitimized you to the old money crowd that had been ignoring you for decades. I was your golden ticket into the Oak Ridge Country Club, and you happily paid the admission fee. I did you a massive favor by marrying Chloe. I elevated you. You were nothing but ambitious nobodies before I gave you my name. Chloe let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. Trent, she whimpered, her voice trembling with heartbreak and terror. How can you say that I am your wife? We are building a life together. Trent turned his head slowly, looking at Chloe with a level of disgust that made my skin crawl. We are not building anything. He sneered, his words sharp as broken glass. You were a convenient mark, Chloe. A desperate, status-obsessed woman with a wealthy father who was desperate to buy his way into high society. You think I enjoyed listening to you complain about the caterers and the pool boys? I needed a steady stream of capital to keep my creditors happy. And your father was foolish enough to hand over his entire pension just to say he had an asset manager in the family. You were nothing but a walking ATM, and now the machine is completely empty. My mother covered her ears, shaking her head violently from side to side. She could not handle the destruction of her carefully curated world. The man she had defended just minutes ago, the man she had been willing to disown me for, was standing in front of her, stripping away every ounce of her dignity. He was hurling their deepest insecurities back in their faces, exposing the ugly racial and class dynamics they had willingly exploited to climb the social ladder. You ungrateful monster! Marcus finally roared, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. I gave you everything. I sponsored you. I trusted you with my life savings. And you lost it all because you wanted to play with the big boys, Trent shot back, stepping aggressively toward my father. But guess what, Marcus? The big boys do not send strongly worded letters when you default on a loan. They send men with weapons. They send people who will burn that Hamptons house to the ground with you inside it if they do not get their money tonight. The bank foreclosure is the least of your problems. The syndicate holds the actual deed, and they operate entirely outside the law. The fight drained out of my father instantly. The booming patriarch collapsed into a hollow, trembling shell of a man. The reality of the physical danger finally pierced through his thick layer of denial. He looked at Trent, then at Chloe, and finally his desperate, terrified gaze landed on me. My mother followed his look. Brenda dropped her hands from her ears and stared at me. The arrogant woman who had just tried to extort me was gone. In her place was a terrified, cornered woman begging for her life. The shift in power was absolute. I held the keys to their survival, and they knew it. Brenda cried out, scrambling out of her chair. She rounded the table and practically fell to her knees next to me. Maya, please, you have to listen to me. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the table. Julian remained by my side, a silent, immovable guard. Maya, we are in danger, Brenda sobbed, her manicured fingers clawing at the sleeve of my blazer. You heard him. These people are coming tonight. They are going to hurt us. They will hurt Chloe. They will take everything we have left. You have the money now. Julian said the trust transferred entirely to you. You have the $1.5 million. You can pay them off. You can make this go away. We will pay you back, I swear it. We will sell the cars. We will sell my jewelry. We will do whatever it takes. Just wire the funds to Trent so he can stop these people. Marcus stood up, his legs shaking, and took a hesitant step toward me. Maya, please, my father begged, tears openly streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. I was wrong. I was a fool. I let my pride blind me. But we are your family. You cannot just sit there and let us be destroyed. We are begging you. You have to save us. I looked down at my mother weeping on the floor next to my chair. I looked at my father stripped of all his power and authority, pleading for salvation. I looked at Chloe curled into a ball, shattered by the realization that her husband despised her. For 28 years, I had craved my parents' validation. I had worked myself to the bone, trying to earn a fraction of the love they poured unconditionally into Chloe. And now here they were, entirely at my mercy. I slowly reached out and gently peeled my mother fingers off my jacket. I smoothed the fabric, adjusting my cuffs before I met her terrified, tear-filled eyes. You want me to save you? I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper that carried through the entire room. You want me to empty my bank account, sacrifice my future, and bail you out of a disaster you created, just like you saved me when I was 18? The silence that followed my pointed question was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. Brenda recoiled as if I had physically struck her across the face with a brick. Her perfectly manicured hands dropped from my jacket, hovering in the cold air before slowly falling into her lap. Marcus just stared at the floor, utterly unable to meet my gaze. The suffocating weight of my 18th birthday hung in the air between us, a toxic ghost they had successfully ignored for a decade. Now, the angry ghost was demanding answers, and they had absolutely nothing left to offer me. "I am not giving you a single cent," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, hollow finality. "I am not paying your debts. I am not saving this house. I am certainly not handing over my grandmother's hard-earned money to bail out a criminal syndicate because you were too busy playing country club royalty to notice your son-in-law was a fraud." My mother let out a strangled gasp, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. "Maya, please," Brenda pleaded, her voice cracking under the strain of pure desperation. "We made a mistake. I know we were hard on you, but you cannot hold on to the past when our lives are on the line. We are a family. You have to forgive us." "Forgive you," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Forgiveness implies a mistake, Brenda. What you did was a calculated, deliberate theft. You did not just fail to support me. You actively sabotaged my future to fund Chloe's vanity." Marcus finally found a fraction of his voice. "That is not fair, Maya," he mumbled weakly, still refusing to look at me. "We had financial obligations. We had to maintain our standing in the community. Chloe's wedding was a major social event. It required a certain level of investment to ensure she married into the right circles. You drained my entire college savings account to pay for an ice sculpture shaped like a swan and a custom-imported silk gown." I shot back, the anger I had buried for 10 years finally boiling to the surface. "I watched you sign the withdrawal slip. I begged you to leave enough for my first semester tuition. You told me to take out loans because Chloe's big day took priority. You threw me to the wolves so you could impress a room full of superficial snobs who do not even care about you." Chloe whimpered from her chair, curling tighter into herself. "I did not know they took your money," she cried softly. "I swear I did not know. You knew I was working 3 night shifts a week just to afford a shared apartment and ramen noodles," I said, turning my focus to my sister. "You knew I was falling asleep in my morning lectures because I spent the entire night scrubbing floors at a diner to pay for my textbooks. You drove your brand new luxury car past my bus stop every single day, Chloe. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you were an innocent bystander. You happily built your fantasy life on top of my ruined dreams." Julian stepped closer, his presence a solid, comforting wall of support behind my chair. He did not speak. He did not need to. His absolute silence commanded the room, a stark contrast to the frantic, begging mess my family had become. He let me fight this battle, knowing I had waited my entire life to deliver this verdict. My parents looked utterly defeated. The wealthy, arrogant aristocrats were gone, replaced by 2 pathetic strangers begging a daughter they had abused for a lifeline. They expected me to cave. They expected the dutiful, desperate girl they had raised to desperately seek their approval by handing over the cash. They fundamentally misunderstood who was sitting in front of them. "My financial independence was not an accident," I declared, looking directly into my father's eyes. "It was not a stroke of luck, and it certainly was not the result of your parenting. I built my life from the ground up because you left me with absolutely no other choice. I survived because the trauma of your abandonment forced me to become unbreakable. Every late night, every missed meal, every moment of sheer exhaustion was a direct result of your greed. You taught me that family is a liability. You taught me that the only person I can rely on is myself." Brenda let out a wretched, guttural sob, collapsing completely onto the hardwood floor. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. Marcus just stared at me, his eyes wide and hollow, finally recognizing the monster he had created by neglecting me. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a deliberate scraping sound. I smoothed my jacket, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. The invisible chains they had wrapped around my neck were finally severed. I owed them nothing. I was walking out of this house, and I was never coming back. A sharp, manic bark of laughter shattered the silence. Trent was leaning against the mahogany table, his shoulders shaking with a terrifying, unhinged amusement. He threw his head back and laughed louder, the sound echoing off the high ceilings like a warning siren. It was the laugh of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Keep your money, then," Trent sneered, wiping a tear of manic amusement from his eye. He stepped away from the table, walking slowly toward the large bay windows overlooking the front driveway. He pulled the heavy velvet curtains back just a fraction. The glow of headlights cut through the darkness outside, illuminating the manicured lawn in harsh mechanical beams. "You see," Maya Trent whispered, turning back to face the room with a deadly calm smile. "The collectors are outside right now. Let us see your forensic accounting save you from a baseball bat." The heavy oak doors suddenly felt fragile. A suffocating silence blanketed the space, completely erasing the manic echoes of Trent and his deranged laughter. Everyone froze like statues. Outside the windows, the harsh glare of headlights swept across the manicured lawn, casting long shadows against the expensive wallpaper. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over gravel signaled the arrival of multiple vehicles. They did not park politely. The engines roared aggressively, tires skidding to an abrupt halt. Car doors slammed shut in rapid succession, reverberating through the floorboards. My mother let out a high, thin whimper, her hands flying to her throat as she backed away from the table. Marcus stood paralyzed, his eyes wide and unblinking, watching the entryway with the sheer terror of a man who finally realized his money could not buy his way out of physical danger. Trent stood tall, puffing out his chest, a sickeningly confident smirk stretching across his face. He actually believed the imminent threat of violence would finally break my resolve and force me to surrender the money to save their pathetic lives. Then the pounding began. It was a violent, thunderous hammering against the heavy double doors of our private dining room. The wood rattled, the sheer force threatening to splinter the frame into pieces. Chloe screamed a shrill, piercing sound and dove behind Brenda. She cowered like a frightened child, burying her face in our mother's expensive silk blouse, trembling so violently that Brenda nearly lost her balance trying to hold her upright. Marcus instinctively took a step backward, raising his hands in a futile defensive posture, bracing himself for the inevitable breach. He looked utterly pathetic, a hollow shell of the domineering patriarch who had ordered me around for decades. Trent, however, looked absolutely triumphant. He crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction as he watched my parents unravel. He turned his smug gaze toward me, clearly expecting to see me crying, begging, or scrambling to transfer the funds to his offshore accounts. I did none of those things. I simply sat there perfectly composed, my posture relaxed, and my breathing even. Julian remained standing right beside me, his hands casually clasped behind his back, looking more like he was waiting for a valet than a violent mob syndicate. The absolute calm we displayed seemed to confuse Trent for a fleeting second, but the relentless, aggressive battering against the door quickly drew his attention back to his incoming salvation. The double doors burst open with a deafening crash, the brass handles slamming hard against the interior walls. Plaster dusted the carpet as the sheer kinetic energy of the breach sucked the air out of the room. Chloe shrieked again, covering her head and dropping to her knees, pulling Brenda down with her into a cowering heap of designer fabric and blind panic. Marcus stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen chair and landing hard on the floor, scrambling away from the entrance like a cornered rat. Trent took a confident step forward, opening his arms wide in a grand welcoming gesture, ready to negotiate with the ruthless loan sharks he had unleashed upon his own family. But the triumphant greeting died in his throat. The words evaporated into a choked gasp of pure, unfiltered confusion. The men pouring into the dining room were not shadowy thugs carrying baseball bats, brass knuckles, or crowbars. They were not the ruthless underground enforcers Trent had desperately promised. They were a highly coordinated, heavily armed tactical team of federal agents. Black tactical gear, bulletproof vests, and secured sidearms replaced the leather jackets and street weapons Trent had anticipated. The bold yellow letters spelling out FBI across their tactical vests gleamed under the crystal chandeliers. They swarmed the room with absolute terrifying precision, instantly securing every exit and locking down the perimeter before my parents could even draw a single breath. Trent stumbled backward, his arms dropping to his sides as all the color rapidly drained from his face. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head in a desperate attempt to deny the reality unfolding right in front of him. This was impossible. This was not the backup he had called. His shadow syndicate had vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of the federal government. From the center of the tactical formation, a single figure emerged, walking with the slow, measured authority of a man entirely in charge. He wore a sharp, tailored suit beneath a lightweight tactical jacket. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his sharp, calculating eyes missed absolutely nothing. I recognized him instantly. He was the older man from the blurry surveillance photographs Trent had tried to use to blackmail me months ago, the man my brother-in-law falsely assumed was a corrupt corporate rival. Special Agent Henderson surveyed the wreckage of the dining room, his gaze sweeping past the shattered glass, the ruined table, and the cowering figures of my mother and sister. He looked at Marcus shivering on the floor, and then his eyes locked onto Trent. The young finance bro was practically hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the absolute certainty of his impending incarceration finally crushed his fragile ego. Henderson did not offer Trent a single word. He did not issue a command, read him his rights, or even acknowledge his pathetic existence. He simply walked straight past the trembling criminal, treating him like a meaningless piece of furniture. Henderson marched directly toward my side of the table, his heavy footsteps thudding against the hardwood floor. The armed agents held their positions, creating a secure ring around the room. Julian stepped back slightly, offering a respectful nod as the veteran federal agent approached my chair. Henderson stopped exactly 2 feet away from me. He stood tall, adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket before offering a crisp, formal nod of deep respect. "Wire transfer confirmed," Director Henderson stated clearly, his authoritative voice echoing through the silent, terrified room. "We have the paper trail." The sheer impossibility of the situation struck Trent like a massive physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He staggered backward, bumping into the edge of the shattered table. "Director," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically from Henderson's badge to my face. "What are you talking about? Who are you calling, Director?" I remained seated, the cool leather of my chair grounding me amidst the chaos. I folded my hands together, resting them on the table, and offered Trent a smile that held zero warmth. "I am the Director, Trent." I answered, my voice steady and devoid of mercy. "You spent the last 3 years underestimating my intelligence, assuming my career in financial forensics was just some cute hobby I picked up to avoid your insufferable family dinners. You thought I was busy pushing paper in a cubicle. Instead, I run my own private corporate investigative firm." Trent's jaw dropped. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin looking sickly and gray under the harsh chandelier light. My parents stared at me as if I had just grown a second head. Brenda, still huddled on the floor amidst the broken glass, slowly released her death grip on Chloe's arm. Marcus practically stopped breathing, his mouth hanging open in silent disbelief. "You honestly believed you found a secret underground syndicate willing to float you $2 million with zero collateral checks?" I continued, standing up slowly to dominate the space. "You thought you were outsmarting the federal banks, outmaneuvering regulatory agencies, and playing a high-stakes game of shadow finance. You are incredibly gullible, Trent. That shadow syndicate you have been wiring money to for the past 8 months does not exist. It is a shell company, an LLC created, registered, and entirely operated by my firm." The realization hit the room with the force of a bomb. Trent's knees buckled slightly. He reached out to brace himself against the wall, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "You," he whispered, the sound barely escaping his constricted throat. "You were the creditor." "I was your creditor, your shadow bank, and your absolute worst nightmare," I confirmed, stepping closer to him to ensure he heard every syllable. "Every time you thought you were cleverly hiding assets, every time you transferred funds through encrypted offshore accounts to cover your failing margins, you were routing that money directly onto my secure servers. I set the trap, Trent, and you blindly walked right into it. You handed me the entire map of your financial crimes on a silver platter. I did not just catch you stealing. I facilitated the transactions that proved your undeniable guilt." The federal agents tightened their perimeter, their hands resting cautiously on their tactical belts. Chloe began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as the magnitude of her husband's crimes penetrated her skull. She looked at Trent as if he were a complete stranger, a monster wearing a tailored suit. She finally realized her safety net was a total illusion. Do you understand the staggering level of arrogance it takes to steal a man's entire pension and then use his own house as collateral? I asked, my voice rising in volume, echoing off the wood panels. I meticulously tracked every single penny you ruthlessly siphoned from Marcus. I documented the massive wire fraud. I traced the complex money laundering networks you used to mask the missing capital. I even logged the elder abuse charges you triggered the second you forged my father's signature on those property transfer documents. Marcus gasped loudly, his hands flying to his mouth in sheer terror. Forged my signature, he croaked, looking at Trent with horror. You actually forged my signature on the house deed. Brenda let out a piercing wail, the sound tearing through her throat. You stole our home, Brenda sobbed, crawling toward Trent on her knees, disregarding the glass cutting into her skin. We gave you everything. We treated you like a king. We pushed our own daughter away just to make you comfortable. You parasite. You took our entire life away from us. Of course he did, Brenda. I snapped, refusing to break eye contact with Trent. He bled you entirely dry. He drained your retirement accounts, leveraged your property to the limit, and prepared to leave you homeless just to cover bad market bets. He degraded you, humiliated you, and used you. And while you were busy worshipping the ground he walked on, I was compiling a 300-page dossier of irrefutable digital evidence. I handed that comprehensive dossier directly to Special Agent Henderson and the FBI exactly 48 hours ago. Trent's eyes darted frantically toward the exit, his survival instincts finally overriding his paralyzing shock. He lunged aggressively to his right, aiming for the kitchen doors in a desperate bid for freedom. He did not make it 2 steps. Agent Henderson moved with terrifying, highly practiced speed. He grabbed Trent by the collar of his ruined custom shirt and violently slammed him face first into the dining room wall. The heavy impact rattled the framed artwork hanging nearby, knocking a priceless painting to the floor. Trent let out a pathetic, breathless yelp of pain as 2 other agents immediately swarmed his position, grabbing his wrists and twisting them sharply behind his back. The distinct metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping into place echoed loudly through the silent room. "Get off me!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate shriek. He writhed uselessly against the wall, his cheek pressed hard against the floral wallpaper. Marcus. Marcus. Call my attorneys. Call the firm right now. You have to fix this. They cannot do this to me. I am your son-in-law. Marcus remained frozen on the floor, utterly incapable of forming a coherent thought, let alone making a phone call to save the miserable man who had just destroyed his entire life. He just stared blankly at the wall, completely shattered by the devastating revelation of Trent's ultimate betrayal. Julian stepped forward casually, adjusting the crisp cuffs of his immaculate suit jacket. He looked down at Trent, offering a smile that was sharp enough to draw blood, enjoying the moment. I highly advise against attempting to retain legal counsel. At this current moment, Trent. Julian stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. Retainers require liquid capital. And since Maya's firm just provided the FBI with everything they need to execute a federal seizure, every single one of your bank accounts, offshore holdings, and hidden assets were permanently frozen exactly 10 minutes ago. The sheer finality of that statement hung in the air, a death knell for the meticulously constructed facade of invincibility. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire adult life was permanently erased, replaced by the gaping terror of a cornered animal. 2 burly federal agents seized him by the biceps, their grips like iron vices, as they forcibly spun him toward the ruined doorway. Trent thrashed wildly, his expensive Italian loafers slipping on the scattered debris. But his resistance was entirely futile against the sheer physical power of the tactical team. He began to babble uncontrollably, a pathetic stream of threats, pleas, and frantic demands for phone calls that no one was ever going to answer. The agents marched him out of the room with brutal efficiency, his protests echoing down the grand hallway before being abruptly cut off by the heavy slam of a reinforced vehicle door outside. The flashing red and blue lights reflecting through the bay windows painted a chaotic pattern across the dining room walls, a visual representation of the absolute ruin my family had just brought upon themselves. Special Agent Henderson offered me one final respectful nod before turning on his heel and leading the remainder of his team out into the damp night air, leaving my parents and my sister alone with the devastating consequences of their own boundless greed. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, suffocating, and thoroughly poisoned by the scent of shattered crystal and lingering fear. Chloe remained paralyzed on the floor for several agonizing seconds, her breath hitching in shallow, erratic gasps as she stared at the empty doorway where her husband had just been forcibly removed. Then the true reality of her situation finally breached her profound sense of entitlement. It was not the loss of Trent that broke her. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that the limitless bank accounts, the luxury cars, and the country club memberships had just evaporated into thin air. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her custom silk gown tearing against a sharp shard of broken plate, completely oblivious to the physical damage. She dragged herself across the expensive Persian rug until she reached my feet, her hands shooting out to fiercely grip the hem of my tailored jacket. "Maya, please," she wailed, her face contorted into a mask of pure, selfish desperation. "You have to stop this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you made a mistake." The sheer volume of her sobs caused her heavy makeup to run down her cheeks in dark, muddy streaks. She shook my jacket violently, looking up at me with wild, panicked eyes. "You cannot do this to me," she screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "I am your sister. I cannot be a poor convict's wife. My friends will destroy me. I will lose everything." The sheer terror of facing real consequences for the very first time in her pampered existence completely shattered her carefully constructed socialite persona. I looked down at the weeping, pathetic mess groveling at my feet, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no lingering familial loyalty, not even a satisfying rush of vengeance, just a profound, icy detachment. I planted my heel firmly on the ground and took a deliberate, forceful step backward, physically tearing the fabric of my jacket directly out of her frantic grip. "Do not ever touch me again," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that caused her to flinch as if struck. Chloe slumped forward, her hands hovering empty in the air, her face twisted in shock at my absolute refusal to comfort her. "You are not a victim here, Chloe." I continued, my words slicing through her manufactured hysterics with surgical precision. "Do not insult my intelligence by crying over a lifestyle you built entirely on stolen money and shattered lives. You knew exactly what Trent was doing, just like you knew exactly where the money for your extravagant wedding came from 10 years ago. You willfully closed your eyes to the financial abuse, because holding him accountable would have meant sacrificing your designer handbags and your exotic vacations. You were a willing, eager accomplice to every single theft, every fraudulent wire transfer, and every lie. You happily allowed our parents to bleed my future dry, just so you could play the role of the wealthy socialite. You loved the lavish benefits of Trent's crimes too much to ever ask where the cash was originating. Therefore, you do not get to play the innocent, devastated spouse now that the federal government is seizing the assets you helped steal. You are going to face the exact same crushing poverty you happily condemned me to endure a decade ago." My mother continued to weep quietly in the corner, unable to process the total destruction of her golden child's fantasy life. But Marcus predictably could not handle the shift in power. The sight of his favorite daughter sobbing on the floor, rejected and humiliated, triggered a desperate, foolish need to reassert his imaginary dominance. He pushed himself up from the floor, brushing the dust from his trousers with shaking hands. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the arrogant authority he had weaponized against me for my entire childhood. His face flushed a dark, angry red as he glared at me, refusing to accept the reality of the cratering world around him. "Fine!" Marcus shouted, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and stubborn denial. "Let him rot in a federal cell. We do not need Trent, and we certainly do not need you, Maya. You can take your money and your arrogant attitude and get out of our sight." He stepped over a broken chair, pointing a shaking finger toward the front door. "We are still the victims here. We still have our home. We still have our investments, and we still have our flawless standing in this entire community." The echo of my father's desperate, blustering declaration hung over the ruined dining room like a bad joke. He stood there, chest puffed out, breathing heavily through his nose, clinging to the phantom remnants of his social kingdom. He genuinely believed that the walls of his sprawling estate and the zeros in his portfolio could shield him from the nuclear blast Trent had just detonated. I stared at him, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out for 10 agonizing seconds. I wanted him to savor that fleeting illusion of safety. I wanted him to feel the exact dimensions of his imaginary fortress before I burned it to the ground. Julian let out a low, humorless chuckle, shifting his weight as he looked at my father with unmasked pity. I did not laugh. I simply turned on my heel, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and walked back to my chair. I reached down and lifted my sleek black leather briefcase, placing it gently onto the only undamaged section of the mahogany table. The metallic snap of the latch's opening sounded like twin gunshots in the quiet room. Marcus watched me with narrowed eyes, his bravado faltering slightly at the sight of the briefcase. He crossed his arms over his chest, trying to maintain his authoritative stance, but his nervous swallowing betrayed his rising panic. Brenda, who had been weeping silently near the corner, slowly raised her head, her tear-streaked face pale and drawn. Chloe remained on the floor, staring blankly at the wall, completely broken by my earlier rejection. I reached into the leather compartment and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I opened it with deliberate slowness, extracting a multi-page legal document. It was crisp, pristine, and officially bound. A shiny gold notary seal caught the light from the chandeliers, glinting like a warning beacon. I held it for a brief moment, feeling the satisfying weight of absolute victory in my hands, before I tossed it onto the table. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the paper and pushed it firmly across the polished wood. It slid with a soft hissing sound, coming to a dead stop exactly 1 inch from my father's shaking fingertips. "Read it, Marcus," I instructed, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Read it carefully." He stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table. He did not want to touch it. He knew deep in his gut that whatever was printed on those pages would finalize his destruction. But his ingrained need to maintain control forced his hand. He reached out, his fingers trembling violently, and picked up the thick stack of paper. He adjusted his posture, trying to look imposing, and began to read the bold black text on the first page. I watched the exact moment his entire reality fractured. His eyes widened to impossible proportions, darting frantically back and forth across the legal jargon. His jaw dropped, and the healthy flush of anger rapidly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His breath began to hitch shallow and fast as he flipped to the second page, then the third, his hands shaking so severely that the paper rattled loudly in the silent room. "What is it?" Brenda croaked, her voice fragile and laced with dread. "Marcus, what does it say? Tell me." He could not speak. He just stared at the shiny gold seal, his mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a raw, primal terror that completely erased the arrogant patriarch I had known my entire life. The paper slipped from his nerveless fingers, fluttering down to land on top of the shattered porcelain scattered across the rug. The bold, capitalized words at the top of the document were now visible to everyone. It was a formal, finalized property deed. "You do not have a home, Marcus," I said, offering him a slow, merciless smile. "You do not have a sprawling estate. You do not have investments. And you absolutely do not have a flawless standing in this community." When Trent spectacularly defaulted on the massive collateral he put up for that shadow loan, my investigative firm's LLC legally and swiftly seized the asset. "You signed those deeds over to him, remember? You gave him the keys to the castle. I bought your house at a private, expedited federal auction exactly 3 days ago." Brenda let out a strangled, breathless gasp, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. She stumbled forward, her knees giving out, and she collapsed against the edge of the table. "No!" she wailed, shaking her head frantically. "No, that is our house. We have lived there for 30 years. You cannot do this. You are our daughter. I am the owner of the property." "Brenda," I corrected her coldly, picking up the deed and securing it safely back inside my briefcase. "I hold the title, I hold the mortgage, and I hold the absolute legal right to dictate who resides on the premises. You financed your lavish country club lifestyle and Chloe's fairy tale existence by turning a blind eye to massive financial fraud. You mortgaged your own future and handed the pen to a sociopath. I merely collected on the debt." Marcus finally found a fraction of his voice, though it was nothing more than a hoarse, pathetic whisper. "You bought our house," he asked, staring at me with hollow, defeated eyes. "You planned this. You orchestrated this entire thing just to ruin us." "I did not orchestrate your greed, Marcus." I shot back, my tone hardening into steel. "I did not force you to neglect me. I did not hold a gun to your head and make you drain my college savings to buy Chloe an ice sculpture. I did not force you to blindly sign away your property rights to a fraudulent son-in-law just because he drove a nice car and flattered your massive ego. You ruined yourself." I just sat back, documented the carnage, and purchased the wreckage at a steep discount. Julian moved to stand directly beside my shoulder, projecting an imposing wall of security. "The eviction notices were formally served to the estate managers this afternoon," he added smoothly, his professional tone cutting through the thick layer of hysteria. "You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. The locks will be changed on Monday morning, and any personal property left behind will be considered abandoned and disposed of accordingly. I highly suggest you spend less time crying and more time packing." Chloe, who had been remarkably silent, finally registered the totality of the situation. The realization that she was losing the house, the money, the status, and the husband, all in one catastrophic evening, finally short-circuited her brain. She let out a long, continuous scream of pure agony, burying her face in the carpet and pounding her fists against the floor. She was completely untethered from reality, a spoiled princess watching her entire kingdom burn to ash. My mother crawled toward Marcus, grabbing his pant leg, weeping hysterically, begging him to fix it, begging him to wake up from this nightmare. But Marcus just stood there, staring at the empty space where the federal agents had dragged Trent away. He was a broken man, stripped of his wealth, his pride, and his power. I snapped my briefcase shut, the finality of the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket and looked down at my biological family one last time. They were strangers to me now, pathetic ghosts of a past I had successfully conquered and outgrown. I owed them absolutely nothing. Julian gently placed a hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the exit. We stepped over the broken glass, walked past the sobbing figures on the floor, and exited through the shattered double doors. We did not look back. We walked out into the cool night air, leaving them to drown in the absolute ruin of their own making. The damp evening air hitting my face felt like a baptism washing away 30 years of toxic obligation. Julian's hand remained a steady, grounding presence against my lower back as we moved across the wet pavement of the restaurant's private parking lot. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the scent of approaching rain fill my lungs. The distant wail of police sirens echoed through the city streets, a fitting soundtrack to the spectacular collapse of the family empire. We had almost reached the sleek black SUV waiting for us near the valet stand, when a frantic, stumbling clatter of high heels against cobblestone shattered the fragile piece. "Maya, wait!" a ragged, breathless voice shrieked through the darkness. I stopped, gravel crunching beneath my shoes, and turned slowly. Brenda was sprinting across the parking lot, looking completely unhinged. Her meticulously styled hair hung in damp, tangled strands across her face. The expensive silk blouse she wore was wrinkled and stained with spilled wine from the dining room floor. She staggered forward, her knees buckling with every other step, fueled entirely by the blind, consuming terror of a woman who had just watched her entire universe disintegrate. She lunged toward me, her hands outstretched like grasping claws, but Julian seamlessly stepped into her path, creating an impenetrable physical barrier between us. Brenda rebounded off his solid frame, gasping for air as she stared at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. "You cannot just walk away," Brenda sobbed, her chest heaving violently. "You have to fix this. You have the money. You have the power. You can stop the bank, Maya. You can talk to the federal agents. You can tell them Trent was acting alone. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot leave us with nothing." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket, my fingers brushing against the crisp folded paper I had prepared for this exact moment. Julian had delivered the verbal shockwave regarding the 48-hour grace period to collect their personal belongings, but I was a woman who dealt in absolute legal certainties. I pulled the document out and held it up under the harsh glare of the parking lot floodlights. It was a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice stamped and certified by the county clerk, officially terminating their residency at the estate. "I am not fixing anything," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, hollow finality. "I am executing my legal rights as the sole property owner. Julian gave you a courtesy window to pack your bags and remove your clothes, but this is the official documentation. You have exactly 30 days before the local sheriff physically removes you from the premises." I stepped around Julian and shoved the heavy paper directly against Brenda's chest. She reflexively brought her hands up to clutch it, her eyes dropping to read the bold black lettering across the top of the page. The moment her brain registered the words, a visceral, full-body tremor seized her frame. The last remaining shred of her country club facade fractured into a million irreparable pieces. She let out a high, thin wheeze that rapidly escalated into a full-blown panic attack. "We have nowhere to go!" Brenda gasped, hyperventilating as she crumpled the eviction notice in her shaking fists. "My friends, the club, the charity boards, they will all know. They will see the moving trucks. They will see the foreclosure notices. I will be a laughingstock. I will be completely ruined. We are broke, Maya. We are absolutely penniless. How am I supposed to face the society pages? How am I supposed to look my peers in the eye?" "Your peers do not care about you, Brenda," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "They never cared about you. That is the greatest tragedy of your pathetic existence. You sold your soul, you sold your dignity, and you happily sold my future just to buy your way into a circle of superficial aristocrats who secretly mocked your desperation. You were so blinded by your obsession with white validation and fake prestige that you destroyed the only genuine relationships you ever had." Brenda let out a strangled cry, shaking her head in frantic denial, but I refused to let her escape the truth. I stepped closer, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. "You and Marcus spent decades groveling for the approval of generational wealth that looked down on your new money hustle." I continued, my words slicing through the damp air with surgical precision. "You forced Chloe to marry Trent because he had the right pedigree, the right skin color, and the right country club membership. You happily ignored his glaring incompetence and his blatant financial abuse because he provided you with the illusion of elite status. You desperately craved proximity to that power, and you were perfectly willing to sacrifice me to maintain the lie." Brenda covered her ears, letting out a sharp, hysterical wail, but I raised my voice, ensuring every single syllable hit its mark. "You systematically drained my college funds to finance Chloe's ridiculous vanity projects. You watched me work 3 minimum wage jobs, scrubbing diner floors and collapsing from sheer exhaustion, and you felt absolutely nothing. You viewed my suffering as an acceptable casualty in your relentless pursuit of high society acceptance. You chased fake prestige and superficial validation, and in the process it cost you the only daughter who actually worked hard, the only daughter who possessed an ounce of integrity, and the only daughter who ever truly cared for you." The absolute, undeniable reality of her failure finally registered in Brenda's eyes. The realization that her relentless social climbing had left her utterly destitute, facing a highly public, humiliating downfall, snapped the final thread of her sanity. Her sorrow instantly transformed into a blind, vicious rage. With a guttural scream, she lunged forward, her arms swinging back with astonishing speed as she aimed a desperate, violent slap directly at my face. She never made contact. Julian moved with terrifying fluid precision, His hand shot out like a striking snake, catching Brenda's wrist in mid-air, with a grip that resembled a steel vice. The sudden jarring halt sent a shockwave through Brenda's arm, causing her to cry out in surprise and pain. Julian did not flinch. He did not blink. He simply held her arm suspended in the air, his towering presence radiating an aura of absolute, uncompromising menace. "Assaulting a federal contractor carries a minimum 5-year sentence," Julian stated coldly, his voice a dark, dangerous rumble that commanded total obedience. "I suggest you pack your bags instead." He released her wrist with a flick. Brenda stumbled backward, colliding with the table. She did not attempt to strike again. The reality of her powerlessness had penetrated her vanity. She slumped against the wood, clutching her bruised arm, her cries reducing to pathetic gasps. Marcus remained frozen near the doorway. Chloe continued her catatonic staring at the floorboards. They were broken statues in a museum of their own failures. I adjusted my bag and turned my back on the spectacle. Julian fell into step beside me. He extended his arm and I took his hand, our fingers interlacing seamlessly. The contact grounded me, a stark contrast to the conditional touch my family had always weaponized against me. We walked away. The doors stood open, framing our exit. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not pause to savor their misery or listen to the arguments breaking out between my parents. The sound of our synchronized footsteps echoed down the corridor, drowning out the noise of their destruction. With every step we took toward the exit, the suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for 3 decades grew lighter. We moved through the lobby, bypassing the stares of patrons and the hushed whispers of the waitstaff who had caught wind of the implosion in the private wing. The maitre d' offered a nervous bow as we approached the vestibule. I nodded once, leaving a generous tip on his podium for the inconvenience my relatives had caused his establishment. Julian pushed open the glass doors and we crossed the threshold. The transition from the oppressive atmosphere to the crisp reality of the evening was physically jarring. I stopped on the top step, closing my eyes and tilting my head back. The cool night air washed over my face, carrying the scent of impending rain and the distant hum of traffic. I inhaled deeply, pulling the oxygen down into my lungs. It felt remarkably pure. For 30 years, I had been breathing the contaminated air of my parents' conditional love, choking on their impossible expectations, and suffocating under the heavy chain of their constant disapproval. I had spent my life contorting myself to fit into a mold designed for a daughter they never wanted. They demanded subservience and demanded that I shrink myself so Chloe and Trent could appear larger. In that exact moment, standing under the glow of the valet awning, I felt that chain finally snap off my neck. It dissolved into nothingness. I was completely free. The lingering guilt that accompanied any act of self-preservation was entirely absent. I had simply stopped throwing myself onto the tracks to prevent the train wreck they had intentionally engineered. I opened my eyes, feeling a profound clarity settling into my bones. A sleek black Maybach silently pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the neon streetlights. The valet hurried forward to open the rear passenger door. Julian tipped the young man before gesturing for me to enter. I slid into the expansive, leather-lined interior, enveloped instantly by the insulated luxury of the cabin. The soft ambient lighting illuminated the immaculate console, a stark contrast to the violent chaos of shattered porcelain and broken lives we had just walked away from. Julian climbed in right behind me, the heavy door clicking shut with a solid thud that sealed out the ambient noise of the street. The driver smoothly merged the massive vehicle back into the flow of nighttime traffic. I leaned my head against the plush headrest, watching the blurred city lights streak past my window. My mind traced the incredible trajectory of the past 48 hours. The meticulous compilation of the financial dossiers, the precise execution of the asset seizure, the perfectly timed involvement of the federal authorities, and the final confrontation. Every variable had been calculated, and every trap had snapped shut with flawless precision. My firm had neutralized a shadow syndicate, exposed millions in wire fraud, and dismantled the toxic hierarchy of my biological family. I let out a breath, feeling the last remnants of adrenaline draining from my muscles. The war was officially over, and I was the only one left standing on the battlefield. Julian reached across the center console, retrieving a crystal decanter and 2 tumblers. He poured a small measure of amber liquid into each glass, handing one to me with a quiet, knowing smile. The ice clinked softly, a gentle sound that further anchored me to the present reality. I took a slow sip, letting the fiery warmth spread down my throat and settle into my chest. We rode in comfortable silence for several blocks, allowing the profound magnitude of what we had just accomplished to fully wash over us. There was no need for extensive debriefing or boastful celebration. The undeniable success of the operation spoke volumes on its own. We had successfully executed one of the most complex corporate takeovers in recent history, and we had managed to do it all without breaking a single law. He shifted slightly in his seat, turning his body toward me. The ambient light from passing storefronts illuminated the sharp angles of his profile, highlighting the fierce intelligence and unwavering loyalty that made him such an exceptional partner. He rested his arm casually across the back of the plush leather seat, his fingers lightly brushing against my shoulder. He looked at me, a playful spark dancing in his dark eyes, cutting through the heavy professional intensity that had dominated our entire evening. The sheer relief of leaving my toxic past entirely behind me was beginning to manifest as a genuine radiant smile on my face. He tilted his head slightly, swirling the liquid in his glass. "So," Julian asked, his voice a smooth, rich baritone, "are we still keeping the original wedding date?" I looked at him, feeling the absolute certainty of my future solidifying in my mind. I took another slow sip from my glass, my smile widening into something undeniably triumphant. "We are upgrading it, grading." 2 weeks evaporated into a whirlwind of flawless execution. The damp, toxic air of my past was entirely replaced by the warm, salt-tinged breeze of the Amalfi Coast. The sheer speed of the transition was dizzying, yet every detail unfolded with the calculated perfection I applied to my corporate takeovers. We had not just upgraded the wedding, we had elevated it into a masterpiece of private luxury. The sprawling cliffside villa we secured for the weekend overlooked a private stretch of pristine white sand and endless azure water. Vibrant bougainvillea tumbled down the ancient stone walls, framing a gorgeous terrace where the ceremony would take place. There were no rented country club halls, smelling of stale gin and forced pleasantries. There was only the gentle roar of the Mediterranean Sea and the intoxicating scent of blooming jasmine. I had hired the best event coordinators in Europe, giving them a blank check and a single directive to create an environment utterly devoid of stress. Crystal chairs caught the late afternoon sunlight, arranged perfectly in intimate, curving rows that promoted genuine connection. Urns overflowing with white orchids and hydrangeas flanked the altar. A string quartet played softly in the background, their melodies blending seamlessly with the ocean waves. The atmosphere was breathtakingly serene, a contrast to the chaotic screaming spectacle I had left behind in that ruined dining room. I stood near the edge of the bridal suite balcony, looking down at the gathering crowd. The guest list was the most beautiful aspect of the entire production. There was no Marcus aggressively networking near the bar. There was no Brenda criticizing the floral arrangements to elevate her own fragile ego. There was no Chloe demanding the photographer focus exclusively on her designer dress. My biological family had been surgically excised from the narrative, entirely replaced by people who actually embodied the word. Julian's family moved through the venue with an effortless, genuine warmth. His parents, who had welcomed me with open arms and zero conditions, were laughing freely with my lead forensic accountants. His sisters were busy adjusting the boutonnieres on the groomsmen, their smiles radiant and untainted by petty jealousy. The colleagues who had stood by me during the grueling early years of my firm, the mentors who had championed my sharpest strategies, and the loyal friends who knew the reality of my upbringing, were all present. They drank vintage champagne and shared authentic stories. There were no tense whispers, no calculating glances, and no underlying threats of social ruin. I had surrounded myself with a fortress of actual love and fierce loyalty. I stepped back into the cool, air-conditioned interior of the bridal suite, letting the heavy glass doors slide shut. The room was a sanctuary of white marble and soft silk. My wedding gown hung suspended in the center of the room, a custom masterpiece of structured crepe and delicate French lace. It was not a dress designed to show off wealth to bitter rivals. It was a garment crafted entirely for me. I slid into the gown with the help of my lead investigator, Sarah, who doubled as my maid of honor. She fastened the tiny pearl buttons running down my spine with careful, steady hands. "You look absolutely terrifying and breathtaking," Sarah noted, stepping back to admire the final result. "Julian is going to forget how to breathe when he finally sees you walking down the aisle today." I turned toward the full-length gilded mirror, absorbing the reflection staring back at me. I looked incredibly radiant. My skin glowed with a healthy vitality that had been missing for decades. The perpetual tension that used to knot my shoulders and tighten my jaw was completely eradicated. I was no longer the scapegoat, the afterthought, or the financial safety net for a family of parasites. I was the architect of my own empire, standing at the absolute peak of my personal and professional power. I ran a hand over the smooth fabric of my skirt, feeling a profound, unshakable calmness settling deep into my core. Julian's mother knocked softly before entering the suite. She carried a small velvet box, her eyes crinkling with genuine affection as she approached. She did not offer me a backhanded compliment or a critique disguised as advice. She simply opened the box to reveal a stunning antique diamond bracelet. This belonged to Julian's grandmother. She explained, her voice thick with happy emotion. She always said it should go to a woman with a spine of steel and a heart of gold. "You are exactly what this family needed, Maya. We are so incredibly honored to have you." I allowed her to clasp the cool metal around my wrist, deeply moved by the unconditional acceptance she offered so freely. I thanked her, my voice remarkably steady, and she kissed my cheek before leaving to take her seat. Sarah gave my hand a final encouraging squeeze and slipped out the door to join the bridal procession. I was entirely alone in the suite for the first time all day. The silence was golden, wrapping around me like a protective cloak. I walked over to the marble vanity to apply a final touch of lipstick. My phone, resting near the edge of the sink, vibrated with a harsh, sudden buzz. I ignored it initially, assuming it was a last-minute logistical update from the wedding planner, but it vibrated again and again. 3 rapid, frantic pulses that shattered the tranquility of the room. I set down the lipstick tube and picked up the device. The screen was lit up with a barrage of text messages from an unsaved international number. I swiped open the notifications, my eyes scanning the chaotic blocks of text. The words were misspelled, typed in a clear frenzy of absolute, unadulterated panic. "Maya, you have to answer right now. The feds seized everything. Marcus had a massive heart attack. They are arresting Mom. Please wire us some money today, please." The glowing screen of my phone illuminated the dim corner of the bridal suite, casting a harsh, artificial light against the pristine marble vanity. I stood perfectly still, watching the text bubbles stack up one after another in rapid succession. The initial messages from the unsaved international number were a jumble of frantic demands and exaggerated emergencies, a desperate attempt to shock me into compliance. But as the seconds ticked by, the tone shifted. The digital voice was unmistakably Brenda's. Stripped of her country club arrogance, her words devolved into a pathetic, groveling whine. I swiped my thumb across the glass, scrolling past the initial hysteria, to read the latest breathless updates detailing the total annihilation of their superficial world. "Chloe is waitressing at a diner to pay off Trent's legal fees." Brenda wrote the text, practically dripping with self-pity. "Your father had a minor stroke from the stress. We are living in a motel. Please, Maya, you're our only hope. Family is family." I read the words again, letting the sheer absurdity of the message wash over me. Chloe, the untouchable golden child, who had never worked a single honest day in her entire life, was now forced to scrub tables and fetch coffee. It was a spectacular, poetic reversal of fortune. For years, they had watched me work multiple minimum wage shifts, coming home with blistered feet just to afford my textbooks while Chloe swiped my college fund to finance her luxury vacations. They had scoffed at my exhaustion, treating my labor as a comical inconvenience. Now Chloe was chained to the very reality she had spent her life mocking. She was finally paying the price for turning a blind eye to Trent's malicious financial abuse, all because she had been too addicted to the illusion of elite status to ask where the money was coming from. Marcus had suffered a stroke. The mighty patriarch who had built his identity on intimidation and a hollow corporate throne had finally crumbled under the weight of his own fraudulent empire. He had spent his entire adulthood sacrificing his integrity and his youngest daughter to maintain proximity to power. He had chosen to protect Trent, a criminal with the right pedigree, over his own flesh and blood. Now his legacy was reduced to a stack of federal indictments and a cheap motel room. The stress of losing his fake prestige had physically broken him, exposing the fragile, cowardly man he had always been beneath the tailored suits. Then came the ultimate manipulation. Family is family. They had played that toxic trump card for 3 decades to justify their abuse. They used that phrase whenever they needed a scapegoat, whenever they needed to drain my bank accounts, and whenever they needed me to absorb the consequences of their reckless choices. Family meant blind loyalty when they required a shield, but it meant absolutely nothing when I needed a lifeline. They had systematically stripped away my dignity, stolen my future, and discarded me the moment I stopped being useful. Now, standing in the ruins of their own making, they dared to invoke that sacred bond to demand salvation. I searched my chest, waiting for the familiar, suffocating pang of obligation to strike. I waited for the guilt that had been conditioned into me since childhood, the programmed response that commanded me to fix their messes and sacrifice my own happiness for their comfort. I waited for a sliver of pity to emerge, for the mother begging from a motel room, or the father recovering from a stroke, or the sister scrubbing diner floors. Nothing came. The emotional well was completely dry. My heart beat with a steady, peaceful rhythm. I felt no sorrow, no guilt, and no lingering attachment. I felt only the profound, satisfying clarity of justice taking its natural course. Their downfall was not an unfortunate tragedy. It was the direct, undeniable consequence of their own greed, their own malice, and their own relentless pursuit of superficial validation. They had built their entire existence on a foundation of lies and exploitation, and the structure had simply collapsed exactly as it was destined to. I was not their savior. I was just the architect who had removed the final supporting pillar. I tapped the empty text field, bringing up the digital keyboard. I did not write a long emotional paragraph detailing my grievances. I did not engage with her pathetic attempts at manipulation or offer a scathing critique of their failures. I did not need to explain why they deserved their current misery. Instead, I crafted a response that surgically targeted the very core of their obsession, a single sentence that would serve as the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. My fingers moved swiftly across the glass, typing with deliberate, unapologetic precision. Ask Trent's country club friends for a loan. It was the ultimate brutal reality check. It was a stark reminder that the elite society they had worshipped, the superficial aristocrats they had sold my soul to impress, would never step foot in a cheap airport motel to save them. The country club set did not care about broken men with federal indictments or waitressing wives. They cared only about proximity to power, and the moment Marcus and Brenda lost their wealth, they had instantly become invisible to the very peers they had sacrificed everything to please. I did not wait to see if the message was delivered. I did not care if the words induced another panic attack or sparked a final, impotent rage. I tapped the contact name at the top of the screen, scrolling down past the history of their demands. I hit block caller. A confirmation prompt appeared asking if I was certain I wanted to sever the connection. I pressed confirm without a fraction of a second's hesitation. The digital tether that had linked me to their toxicity was permanently severed. I locked the screen, feeling the sleek metal of the device in my palm. It felt heavy, contaminated by the digital presence of people who no longer existed in my world. I turned toward the pristine, gold-rimmed wastebasket, sitting discreetly beneath the vanity. With a casual, fluid motion, I tossed the phone into the trash can. It landed with a soft, hollow thud against the bottom. I did not need it. Julian and I had established new secure lines of communication, and anyone who actually mattered already knew exactly where to find me. I turned back to the mirror, smoothing the delicate French lace of my gown. The woman looking back at me was luminous, unburdened, and entirely free. I stepped out of the bridal suite, leaving the wreckage of my past in the garbage where it belonged, and walked toward the brilliant sunlit terrace to marry the man who had helped me burn it all down. The Mediterranean sun warmed my skin the moment I crossed the threshold. A collective gasp rippled through the seated guests as I appeared at the top of the stone staircase. The string quartet smoothly transitioned into a rich and soulful rendition of a classic ballad. Sarah took her place at the front and offered me a brilliant, encouraging smile. I did not have a father to walk me down the aisle, and I did not want one. I was stepping into this new chapter under my own power, entirely confident and completely unburdened. The cobblestone path felt incredibly solid today. With every step I took toward the beautiful altar, the faces of my chosen family anchored me. Julian stood waiting under a breathtaking arch of cascading white blooms, looking devastatingly handsome in his custom tuxedo. His dark eyes locked onto mine, radiating a fierce devotion that made my racing heart flutter. There was absolutely no hesitation in his strong stance. He was my dedicated partner, my true equal, and my ultimate sanctuary. The guests seated around us were not superficial business contacts or desperate social climbers seeking favors. They were the loyal people who had celebrated my late office nights. They were the steadfast friends who had wiped my tears during the darkest days of my childhood, and the brilliant mentors who had championed my rapid ascent to the top of the financial world. They represented the family I had meticulously curated, bound together by mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the toxic obligations of blood. I reached the altar, and Julian stepped forward to take my hands. His grip was warm, grounding, and incredibly steady. The officiant was a highly respected mentor and close friend of his family, who began the ceremony with deeply profound opening remarks. He spoke passionately of resilience, of building a strong foundation on unwavering honesty, and of the profound courage it takes to forge your own unique path in life. When it was time to exchange our vows, Julian spoke first. His voice projected clearly over the gentle rhythmic sound of the crashing ocean waves. He promised to fiercely protect my peace, to always honor my ambition, and to stand proudly by my side as a true, unwavering equal. He vowed to build a powerful legacy with me, rooted in absolute authenticity, completely far removed from the superficial demands of polite society. My voice did not tremble when it was finally my turn to speak. I looked directly into his beautiful eyes, laying my guarded heart completely bare. I promised to choose him every single day. I vowed that our sacred union would never be a cheap transaction, never a hollow prop for fake prestige, and never a compromise of our individual, deeply honest truths. We were establishing a permanent partnership built on total transparency, deep mutual respect, and unyielding, fierce loyalty. I promised to fiercely guard the magnificent life we had fought so incredibly hard to create together against any future threats. As we exchanged the simple, elegant platinum bands, the massive symbolic weight of the moment settled peacefully over me. We were not just exchanging expensive jewelry, we were forging an unbreakable, lifelong alliance. The officiant smiled warmly, his hands gesturing expansively toward us. He officially pronounced us husband and wife, granting Julian permission to finally kiss his bride. Julian pulled me close, his strong hands cradling my face, and kissed me with a breathtaking, passionate intensity that instantly elicited a roaring, joyous cheer from the assembled crowd. We turned around to face our beloved guests, our hands raised high together. The applause was deafening, echoing beautifully against the ancient stone walls of the luxurious villa. Looking out at the gorgeous sea of joyful faces, I knew exactly what we represented. We were the absolute, undeniable epitome of Black excellence. We were entirely successful, having carved our massive empires out of raw ambition, brilliant intellect, and relentless grit. We had faced down massive corporate fraud, vile family deception, and the absolute darkest elements of my past, emerging completely unscathed and phenomenally victorious. We were a totally unbreakable force, a stunning power couple ready to conquer the entire world, strictly on our own terms. The ceremony seamlessly transitioned into a lavish, spectacular reception under the sparkling stars. Crystal chandeliers hung elegantly from the sprawling olive trees, casting a warm, highly romantic glow over the expansive stone terrace. Immaculate waiters circulated efficiently with heavy silver trays of decadent appetizers, while the expensive vintage champagne flowed endlessly into crystal flutes. Julian and I moved gracefully through the massive crowd, warmly greeting our wonderful guests and soaking in the intoxicating atmosphere of pure, untainted joy. I was laughing loudly at a hilarious joke Sarah had just told when a highly familiar, sharply dressed figure caught my eye near the grand entrance. Agent Henderson stood quietly at the edge of the busy terrace, looking slightly out of place in his crisp, dark federal suit, carefully holding a beautifully wrapped silver box. I politely excused myself from my friends and walked over to warmly greet him. He offered a highly respectful nod, handing me the lovely gift with a very rare, entirely genuine smile. He sincerely congratulated me on the spectacular wedding before dropping his voice to a quiet, strictly professional register. He explicitly stated that he wanted to deliver the highly anticipated news to me personally, tonight. Trent had officially cracked under the immense pressure of the grueling federal interrogation. He had eagerly signed a full, highly detailed confession, completely implicating his entire network of corrupt criminal conspirators in the massive wire fraud scheme. The federal judge had just handed down a devastating mandatory minimum sentence of exactly 20 years in a maximum security federal prison without the slightest possibility of early parole. I took a sip of my champagne, feeling an overwhelming surge of total satisfaction as I looked back at my gorgeous new husband, fully ready to begin the magnificent rest of our lives. Agent Henderson accepted a crystal flute from a passing waiter, his sharp eyes surveying the joyous crowd before settling back on me and Julian. He took a long, appreciative sip of the vintage champagne, allowing the celebratory atmosphere to momentarily soften his rigid federal posture. Julian stepped closer, wrapping a warm, protective arm around my waist as we waited for the rest of the intelligence. The 20-year sentence was a massive victory, but Henderson's demeanor suggested there were still a few highly satisfying details left to unpack. He leaned in, slightly lowering his voice to ensure our conversation remained confined to our small circle. The mandatory minimum was just the baseline. Henderson explained, a wry smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Trent realized exactly how insurmountable the evidence against him was within the first hour of his official interrogation. Your carefully constructed financial dossiers were completely bulletproof. He had nowhere left to run and no one left to manipulate. Once he understood the sheer magnitude of the incoming wire fraud charges, his arrogant country club bravado vanished entirely. Henderson detailed the incredibly rapid, humiliating collapse of Trent's fragile ego. Faced with the terrifying, unavoidable reality of spending the next 2 decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary, Trent had desperately scrambled for a lifeline. He abandoned the arrogant facade of the untouchable elite and immediately requested a plea deal. The prosecution, however, had absolutely zero incentive to negotiate. We had already provided them with every single document, offshore account routing number, and falsified signature required to secure a conviction. Trent had absolutely nothing of value to offer the authorities, forcing him into a state of blind, completely selfish panic. He tried to bargain with information we already possessed. Henderson continued, shaking his head at the sheer pathetic nature of the attempt. When the prosecution formally rejected his initial plea, he resorted to the only strategy he had left. He decided to drag everyone else down with him. Julian pulled me tighter against his side, his thumb drawing slow, comforting circles on my hip. We listened intently as Henderson outlined the spectacular implosion of my biological family's remaining loyalties. In a desperate, frantic bid to shave a few months off his own lengthy sentence, Trent had completely turned on the people who had sacrificed my future to protect him. He formally testified that Marcus was not merely a passive beneficiary of the fraud, but an active, willing participant who had knowingly shielded the illegal wire transfers through his corporate accounts. Trent provided investigators with specific dates, times, and locations of private meetings where Marcus had explicitly instructed him on how to bypass federal compliance protocols. The betrayal did not stop with my father. Trent had also thrown Chloe directly into the line of fire. He provided federal agents with a comprehensive list of luxury assets, offshore shell companies, and expensive real estate properties registered exclusively in Chloe's name. He testified that she was fully aware the funds fueling her lavish lifestyle were stolen effectively, ensuring she would face her own severe legal consequences. The moment the endless stream of illicit money dried up the unbreakable family bond they had relentlessly preached about, shattered into a million irreparable pieces, it was the ultimate poetic irony. For 30 years, Marcus and Brenda had demanded absolute loyalty, forcing me to endure immense psychological abuse under the guise of protecting our family unit. They had elevated Chloe and Trent to a status of untouchable royalty, convinced that their shared greed would keep them united. Yet the very second their fake prestige was threatened by actual consequences, they viciously turned on one another like cornered animals. There was no honor among them, no genuine love, and absolutely no sacrifice. Their relationships were entirely transactional, built on a fragile foundation of mutual exploitation that instantly dissolved when the wealth was seized. Henderson finished his champagne, his professional duty fulfilled. He offered us both a final respectful nod, expressing his profound admiration for the pristine operation we had executed. He turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Julian and me standing alone at the edge of the beautifully illuminated terrace. The Mediterranean breeze brushed against my skin, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and the joyous sounds of my chosen family laughing together. I looked up at my husband, seeing my own absolute serenity reflected in his deep, dark eyes. We had won the war, and the enemy had obligingly destroyed whatever was left of their own camp. Julian picked up 2 fresh glasses of champagne from a nearby table, handing one to me with a brilliant, breathtaking smile. The crystal felt cool and solid in my hand. I raised my glass, the golden liquid catching the ambient light of the sprawling outdoor chandeliers. There was no need to mourn the spectacular destruction of people who had only ever viewed me as a convenient asset. They were currently navigating the brutal, uncompromising reality of the justice system, entirely stripped of the unearned privilege they had worshipped for decades. To beautiful, undeniable, natural consequences, I said, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable conviction. To beautiful, undeniable, natural consequences, Julian softly echoed gently, clinking his crystal glass against mine. We drank to the undeniable power of truth, the profound peace of genuine love, and the magnificent empire we had built entirely on our terms. I set my empty glass down on a stone pillar, feeling an incredible surge of vibrant energy coursing through my veins. The string quartet transitioned into a lively, upbeat rhythm, drawing guests toward the center of the terrace. Julian extended his hand, his eyes shining with pure adoration. I took it, letting him lead me toward the dance floor. We moved together gracefully under the beautiful starlit Italian sky, completely surrounded by radiant light, joyous laughter, and unbreakable loyalty. I left the bitter, toxic ashes of the past entirely behind me, stepping boldly into a brilliant, absolutely limitless future starting today. The sudden transition from that vibrant Italian terrace to the breathtaking isolation of the Maldives happened in a seamless blur of private jets and quiet luxury. We traded the historic stone of the Amalfi Coast for the pristine white sand and endless turquoise water of the Indian Ocean. Our overwater bungalow, was a masterpiece of secluded architecture, offering panoramic views of a horizon that seemed to stretch into infinity. For the first 2 weeks, we did absolutely nothing but exist in each other's orbit. We swam in the crystal-clear lagoon, ate fresh seafood under the stars, and slept without the lingering shadow of impending family sabotage. My nervous system, which had been locked in a state of high alert for 30 years, finally learned how to completely power down. There were no frantic text messages, no unhinged demands, and no veiled threats of social ruin. The toxic noise of Marcus, Brenda, Chloe, and Trent had been entirely muted by the sheer distance and the legal walls we had erected around our new life. Julian and I spent our mornings drinking rich coffee on our private wooden deck, watching the marine life glide effortlessly beneath us, reveling in the profound peace of a partnership built on absolute mutual respect. But neither of us were wired to simply sit still forever. By the third week of our extended honeymoon, the quiet relaxation naturally morphed into vibrant creative energy. We were empire builders, and the absolute tranquility of the island provided the perfect blank canvas for our next massive move. I sat at the sleek glass table in our living area, the warm ocean breeze ruffling the edges of the large architectural blueprints spread out before me. My laptop glowed with structural renderings and municipal zoning applications. I traced the meticulously drawn lines with my pen, a deep sense of poetic justice settling comfortably in my chest. The blueprints detailed a sprawling, highly advanced facility featuring modern classrooms, dedicated technology labs, an expansive indoor gymnasium, and a beautiful community garden. It was a truly massive investment designed entirely from the ground up, aimed at providing elite educational resources and dedicated mentorship to underprivileged minority youth. It was everything I had desperately needed and was aggressively denied when I was a child. Julian walked up behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my shoulders and pressing a warm kiss to the top of my head. He leaned over, his dark eyes scanning the detailed schematics with keen analytical interest. He knew exactly what the facility represented, but the true masterpiece of this specific project was not just the building itself. It was the precise, highly symbolic location where the foundation would be poured. I tapped the address printed boldly at the top corner of the architectural rendering. It was the exact address of the sprawling suburban mansion where I had grown up. When Marcus's fraudulent financial network had imploded, his assets were swiftly seized and liquidated by the federal government to pay off his massive mounting debts. The bank had immediately foreclosed on the pristine, heavily mortgaged estate that had served as the ultimate glittering crown jewel of their fake prestige. Through a heavily shielded corporate LLC, I had aggressively outbid several major luxury developers to purchase the foreclosed property entirely in cash. I now owned the very ground where I had been systematically degraded, ignored, and financially exploited. I owned the grand dining room where my achievements were mocked. I owned the sweeping mahogany staircase where Chloe had paraded her stolen designer clothes. But I had zero interest in living in a museum of my own childhood trauma. The blueprints sitting on the table were not for a renovation. They were the final approved plans for a total, uncompromising demolition. In less than 3 months, a crew of heavy excavators would arrive at that perfectly manicured address and completely level the massive colonial structure, reducing the physical monument of my family's superficial toxic vanity to a pile of shattered drywall and splintered wood. We were going to completely wipe their hollow legacy off the map. In its place, we would raise a powerful, enduring beacon of actual community wealth and genuine, meaningful support. I turned to look at Julian, letting him see the fierce, unrelenting determination burning in my eyes. This was the ultimate, undisputed flex. My biological family had hoarded resources, committed federal crimes, and destroyed their own flesh and blood just to maintain the shallow illusion of elite status. They worshipped a zip code and sacrificed their souls for country club memberships. I was taking their most prized possession, utterly destroying it, and giving the land back to the brilliant, hardworking kids they would have normally crossed the street to avoid. It was a profound reclamation of space. We were transforming a dark, oppressive environment into an incubator for genuine Black excellence. We were ensuring that the next generation of ambitious, intelligent kids would never have to endure the kind of psychological warfare I had survived. They would have a safe, magnificent fortress where their talents would be fiercely nurtured and heavily funded. Julian smiled a slow, predatory grin that perfectly mirrored my own absolute satisfaction. He understood the monumental weight of this move better than anyone else in the world. He reached across the glass table and picked up the thick stack of legal contracts resting beside the blueprints. These were the finalized incorporation documents for the new philanthropic foundation we were launching together, the legal entity that would officially govern and heavily finance the community center for decades to come. He uncapped his heavy gold fountain pen, the metal catching the bright island sunlight. He did not hesitate for a single second. With smooth, deliberate strokes, Julian signed his name right next to mine on the bottom line of the primary deed, permanently locking in our shared vision. He set the pen down and firmly pulled me into a fierce, triumphant kiss, effectively sealing our untouchable, everlasting legacy. 6 months evaporated in a blur of pouring concrete, erecting steel, and transforming a site of profound trauma into a sanctuary of absolute hope. The warmth of our Maldivian honeymoon was replaced by the crisp autumn air. I stood on the grand steps of the newly completed community center, a marvel of modern architecture that occupied the exact plot of land where my parents' oppressive mansion had once stood. Massive glass windows bathed the indoor atrium in brilliant natural light, replacing the dark, suffocating dining room where my worth was dismantled for decades. A highly advanced technology wing sat precisely where Marcus's home office used to be. A community garden thrived in the soil that once supported Brenda's fiercely guarded rose bushes. We had literally paved over their toxic vanity and planted the seeds of an enduring future. A massive crowd gathered on the front lawn to witness the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Politicians, community leaders, educators, and hundreds of ambitious teenagers filled the space with an electric energy. The press was out in full force, camera flashes bursting against the crisp sky. I wore a perfectly tailored crimson suit, projecting absolute authority and serenity. Julian stood by my side, his presence an unwavering anchor of genuine love and fierce protection. He looked incredibly proud, his dark eyes sweeping over the magnificent facility we had built entirely from the ground up. This was not a hollow public relations stunt. This was a calculated eradication of my family's legacy. I had taken the very foundation of their massive unearned privilege and converted it into a vital life-saving resource for the people they had routinely despised. As the mayor delivered a glowing speech about our philanthropic vision, my gaze drifted past the cheering crowd and across the busy street. The contrast between the radiant celebration on our side of the pavement and the bleak reality of the opposite sidewalk was stark. A lone figure trudged heavily along the cracked concrete, moving with a defeated, exhausted sluggishness that immediately caught my attention. It was Chloe. I barely recognized the woman dragging her feet toward the nearby retail strip mall. The immaculate golden child who had spent her entire existence wrapped in stolen designer silk and unearned arrogance was entirely gone. She wore a generic polyester uniform vest, the dull fabric highlighting the harsh, exhausted lines of her face. Her previously flawless blonde hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her posture was completely broken, bowed under the crushing weight of actual honest labor. She carried a cheap plastic coffee cup, her eyes fixed blankly on the pavement ahead. She looked utterly drained, stripped of the fraudulent wealth that had previously shielded her from the consequences of her own terrible choices. Trent was rotting in a federal penitentiary, Marcus was disgraced and physically ruined, and Brenda was trapped in a cheap motel entirely dependent on whatever meager scraps her favorite daughter could scrape together. Chloe was finally experiencing the brutal, unforgiving reality of the working class she had mocked so relentlessly. As she drew closer to the community center, The loud, joyous cheering of the crowd broke through her exhausted stupor. She stopped walking, her eyes slowly lifting to take in the spectacular facility that had replaced her childhood palace. I watched her process the scene. I watched her eyes widen in absolute horrified recognition as they tracked past the flashing cameras, past the cheering teenagers, and finally landed directly on me. She saw me standing at the absolute pinnacle of power and genuine respect, universally adored and completely untouchable. She saw the massive, undeniable proof of my success, standing exactly where her unearned privilege had been forcibly demolished. The plastic coffee cup slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the pavement and splattering dark liquid across her worn shoes. For a long, pathetic moment, she just stood there, completely paralyzed by the staggering, unavoidable irony of our reversed fortunes. Then desperation seized her. The panicked realization that I was standing less than 50 yards away, holding more wealth and influence than her husband had ever managed to steal, triggered a sudden, frantic reaction. She took a clumsy, desperate step off the curb, her hand raising slightly, as if she intended to push her way through the massive crowd and beg for a miraculous, unearned salvation. She opened her mouth, perhaps preparing to scream my name to invoke the hollow, manipulative concept of sisterhood that she had spent 30 years violently weaponizing against me. She did not make it past the edge of the street. Two towering private security guards stationed at the perimeter of the lawn instantly recognized her. They had been explicitly briefed on every single member of my toxic biological family, and they moved with terrifying, highly efficient precision. They stepped smoothly into her path, crossing their massive arms and forming an impenetrable human wall. They did not raise their voices, and they did not cause a scene. They simply stared her down with cold, absolute authority, silently confirming that she had zero access to my world. Chloe froze, her desperate forward momentum entirely halted by the physical manifestation of my strict, uncompromising boundaries. She looked small, utterly powerless, and completely trapped in her own miserable self-inflicted reality. Our eyes finally met across the vast, insurmountable divide. I did not feel a single drop of pity, nor did I feel the burning, frantic need for vengeance that used to keep me awake at night. I felt only a profound, beautiful emptiness where the pain used to live. I looked at the broken, entirely exhausted woman who had stolen my college fund, and I gave her one small, completely indifferent smile. It was not a smile of malice. It was a simple, absolute dismissal. I turned my back on her, forever picking up the heavy golden scissors to cut the ribbon, letting the roaring, thunderous applause of the crowd wash over me as I stepped into my brilliant, unbroken future.